Hello, my name's Barth, and I'm the kid that's got a spirit problem. Yes, it's true, I got a spirit problem. Last video I was using my gift, and I was telling you something that God Almighty was saying. See, when I use my gift, it's God Almighty talking, and I'm talking, but it's Him. And that's my gift I got, and it's because I got in trouble by God Almighty, and I got a gift. And I was talking about my story, and I was using my gift to tell you what God Almighty had to say about my story. So without further ado, I'm going to pick off where I left off, and here we go. God Almighty said, you don't have the right to be in God Almighty to be so intelligent, Aaron. You have the right to relax and let life go by, and don't be gay, and don't say the N-word, and don't be in God Almighty to say, why do you abuse me? Because God Almighty said it's not abuse, Aaron, it's treatment. I want you to know that if I take your hand in your spirit, and if I make you go, then that means that you are in trouble. And God Almighty said that is the answer, what I do to you, because you have no right to be in God Almighty to be racist. That's the N-word. So knock it off, and don't be in God Almighty to say that it's okay that you can be in God Almighty to say the N-word, because it's not fair that you say the N-word, and it's not fair that you be in God Almighty to just get away with it, Aaron. That's the reason why you're in so much trouble today. Yep. And there's nothing you can do, there's nothing you can say about that's God Almighty. You can do anything about your freedom, about your story, because God Almighty said it's not time for you to take your story and be able to say anything you want and be able to get away with it today, Aaron. That's not fair. There's black spirits that you said the N-word to, and they say, and they say, we might see the value of your sin, and we might say, what are we going to do about this? And God Almighty said they just want to take you, Aaron Barth, and try to say, no, you can't say the N-word to me because I'm black. That's the truth. It's the truth. It's the truth. And you can't get away with racism anymore because God Almighty said, well, Aaron, God Almighty knows the value of your sin. And He said, if you say the N-word one time, but what if you say the N-word 1,000 times? And God Almighty said, that is different. And God Almighty said, I know, Aaron, that you didn't say the N-word to anybody. You said it to spirits you saw. You said it to God Almighty. And you said the N-word every single day. And God Almighty said, well, is it technically racism if you say the N-word to God Almighty when you see what you see and you just do what you do and you see Him and you're like, yep, I see this cloud like behind my backboard in my brain and it's Him. And He says, you have the wrong idea. You don't have the right to express to the people on YouTube that God Almighty is wrong for doing the thing that God Almighty does to you, Aaron, because God Almighty said it's not true that you have a spirit problem out to here. You just don't have the right to be in God Almighty to have your freedom today, because God Almighty said you don't deserve your freedom, Aaron. I'm sorry. You deserve to be counted as a person of God Almighty, though. And you are not the worst thing in the world. And you didn't really do what we make you out to have did. You just talked shit. And you got in trouble by God Almighty for it. And God Almighty said that's the reason why you trashed that puppy. Because God Almighty gave you problems, Aaron. And it's true. It's true. It's true. And you didn't mean to trash that puppy. It was just because God Almighty wanted to take you and discipline you about the things you do and the things you say, and you don't really do anything. You're clean there. But you're like not trying to say the N-word to me, are ya? Because that will make God Almighty pissed. And He said, because I know the value of that word. And I know that that is the reason why you're in so much damn trouble today, Aaron. That's the truth. You have no right to be in God Almighty, to just have freedom, because it's not your fair to have freedom like children in the world that have freedom because God Almighty said they're just children, Aaron, of God Almighty, and so are you. But God Almighty said, I just don't want you to get away with those things. My name is Aaron Barth. You're going to have to catch me after the next show.